Pilot, lawyer, doctor, liar, all before legal drinking age. This is the story of the world's most charming con artist, and possibly the only teenager who ever impersonated an airline captain just to score free flights and fancier peanuts. Let's get one thing straight. Most 16-year-olds are busy failing their driver's test or discovering deodorant. Frank Abagnale? He was busy impersonating grown adults and committing federal crimes with the confidence of a guy who just watched Ocean's 11 once and said, "I could do that." Born in 1948 in Bronxville, New York, Frank was the kind of kid who was too smart for his own good and way too good-looking to be grounded for long. By the time he hit his mid-teens, his parents had divorced, which, in classic origin story fashion, is when Frank went full villain arc. Now, some kids react to divorce by getting angsty and starting a band. Frank? He started forging checks, and not just scribbling a fake signature on his mom's birthday card. No, we're talking full-on fake bank documents, custom rubber stamps, and the kind of detail work that would make a professional counterfeiter say, "Wow, slow down, kid." At just 15, Frank opened his first bank account using his dad's gasoline credit card, and quickly realized, hey, what if I just added a 0 or 2 here and there? Spoiler, the bank didn't catch on. Because it was the 1960s and security was basically, does he have a pulse? Cool, give him the money. And here's where things go from mildly concerning to, you're kidding, right? Frank figured out that if you print your account number on blank deposit slips and casually leave them in bank lobbies, guess what? People just use them. That's right. Total strangers were walking into the bank, depositing money straight into his account. All because he played arts and crafts with deposit slips. It was like crowdfunding for criminals. Before GoFundMe. Before computers. Just pure hustle and a lot of charisma. And what did he do with all that stolen cash? Well, buckle up, because we're about to enter the pilot phase of Frank's career. So, what does a teenage criminal do once he's nailed check fraud? Obviously, he becomes a commercial airline pilot. Naturally, Frank realized that pilots got treated like royalty, free flights, fancy hotels, airport lounges with actual snacks, and he thought, well, I like flying, I like lying, let's combine those. But here's the kicker. He didn't actually fly the planes. He just pretended to be a Pan Am co-pilot so he could hitch rides in the jump seat, the little fold-down seat in the cockpit for extra crew. It's like Uber Pool, but for the skies and with way more danger. To make it happen, he got himself a Pan Am uniform. Did he steal it? Nope. He called the airline, said he was a pilot who lost his uniform, and they were like, "Oh, no problem, sir, what's your size?" Because again, it was the 1960s. If you sounded confident and used enough aviation jargon, people just assumed you were qualified to operate flying metal death tubes. Armed with his costume, Frank flew over 1,000,000 miles on over 250 flights, riding in cockpits across the globe, staying in swanky hotels and never paying a cent. He even signed autographs for kids at airports. Imagine being a 17-year-old who barely passed math, and now you're explaining crosswind landings to an actual adult. But he wasn't done. Oh no, Frank decided being a pilot wasn't quite enough prestige, so he moved on to doctor. Because when you're already faking careers, why not pick one where people's lives depend on you? Now, to be clear, Frank wasn't performing surgeries or delivering babies in parking lots. He became a supervising resident at a Georgia hospital by saying he was a Harvard-trained pediatrician. Because why not aim for Harvard, right? And the most incredible part? He actually pulled it off. For almost a year, he worked hospital shifts, gave instructions to real doctors, and played medical charades, all without killing anyone. Because every time there was a real emergency, Frank just delegated. That looks serious, better call in the specialist. Spoiler, the specialist was not him. You'd think after this he'd go into hiding, maybe open a smoothie stand or something. But nope. Next stop, law school. So, let's recap. By 18, Frank had frauded banks, impersonated a Pan Am pilot, and played pretend doctor at a real hospital without accidentally murdering anyone. Naturally, the next logical step was law school. Because what's more impressive than flying planes and diagnosing patients, arguing legal theory you read about in a borrowed textbook? Frank set his sights on becoming a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. He wanted to work for the state attorney general's office in Louisiana. Because sure, why not? He faked a transcript from Harvard Law, passed himself off as a transfer student, and somehow, got hired as an assistant attorney general. Let that sink in. This teenager, who probably still had acne, was walking around a courthouse, throwing around legal terms and pretending he knew what tort law meant. But here's the twist. Louisiana required that all practicing lawyers pass the bar exam, and Frank actually did. Allegedly, he failed twice, studied hard, or just got extremely lucky, and passed on the third try. The jury's out on whether he truly passed or creatively passed, but the point is, no one questioned it. So there he was, showing up to court like a young, smug Matthew McConaughey from A Time to Kill, throwing out objections, and just vibing in the legal system. Meanwhile, real lawyers were probably wondering why the new guy still looked like he should be attending prom. Eventually, someone did get suspicious, and by someone, I mean an actual Yale graduate who worked with Frank and started noticing inconsistencies, like how Frank never talked shop, dodged real legal conversations, and maybe, just maybe, didn't actually go to Harvard. Frank, being Frank, saw the writing on the courtroom wall and bailed. Again. Packed up, vanished, and moved on to his next con. Now, if you're wondering, how on earth is this guy not in prison yet? Don't worry, that's coming. But first, let's talk about the part where Frank just starts bouncing between identities like he's in a costume montage scene from a spy movie. At this point, Frank Abagnale had tried on more careers than a kid in a Halloween store with no supervision. Pilot? Done. Doctor? Check. Lawyer? Technically, yes, terrifyingly so. But Frank was just warming up. He went full chameleon, slipping into identities faster than most people change passwords. And all the while, he was cashing fake checks like it was his side hustle. Which, let's be honest, it was more like a full-time, multinational operation. Frank bounced all over the globe, from New York to Miami, from France to Sweden, writing bad checks, printing new identities, and charming the pants off everyone from bank tellers to flight attendants. He had fake IDs, fake pass profits, and at least 8 aliases, including names like Frank Williams, Robert Conrad, and even, wait for it, Frank Adams, which, to be fair, sounds less like a con man and more like someone who sells timeshares in Tampa. But here's the genius of Frank's method. He didn't just pretend to be someone important. He pretended to be someone so important that no one dared question him. You don't walk up to a pilot and ask, "Are you really a pilot?" You just assume he knows where the throttle is. He used hotel clerks like human ATMs. He sweet-talked airline employees into comping rooms and first-class seats. And whenever someone started sniffing around his story, boom, new city, new name, new fake job. He even created fake payroll checks using logos from real companies, printing them on his own little crime printer, and depositing them just enough times to stay under the radar. And yet, the radar was starting to pick up a blip. The FBI had finally caught on, and let's just say, they weren't impressed by his extensive resume of lies. So they sent someone special, Agent Joseph Shea, aka the real-life version of Tommy Lee Jones in The Fugitive. Smart, determined, and getting really tired of this kid outrunning justice in perfectly pressed uniforms. Frank, of course, knew he was being hunted. And, like every good movie villain with way too much charm, he decided to up the stakes and keep running. But spoiler, the game of cat and mouse was about to end. And it wasn't going to be with handcuffs in the US. Nope. Try a prison cell in France. Eventually, Frank's luck ran out, and ironically, it wasn't the FBI that got him first. It was France. And not the wine and croissants version of France, the rotting cell with no toilet version. Here's how it went down. Frank was spotted in Montpellier, probably trying to pass himself off as a wine merchant or an off-duty astronaut. An Air France attendant, one of the many flight staff he'd previously charmed and ghosted, saw him and said, "Mon Dieu, it's that guy." She notified the police, and just like that, Frank was arrested. Cue sad French accordion music. Now you might think, okay, he'll just do a few months, wink at the judge, and be back at it. But no, this was not your average white-collar holding cell. Frank was thrown into Perpignan prison, which, fun fact, is not known for its hospitality. It was more medieval dungeon, less Airbnb. He spent 6 months there in conditions that made solitary confinement look like a spa retreat. No bed, barely any food, and exactly 0 fake check templates. From there, he was extradited to Sweden, because apparently Frank had also dabbled in fraud there. Shocking, I know. The Swedes were kinder. More IKEA, less iron bars, and they even considered letting him go after serving his time. But the US said, "Excuse us, we'd like a word." The Swedes handed him over to American authorities, and Frank boarded a flight back home, in handcuffs this time, and very much not in the cockpit. But here's the kicker. Because it's Frank, and he doesn't do normal. He escaped. Yes, escaped. From a moving airplane. Okay, not literally midair. But while being escorted off the plane at JFK Airport, Frank managed to slip away from the feds by ducking into a service door and walking straight out like he owned the place. Because if you walk with confidence, people assume you know where you're going, even if you're supposed to be going to prison. The FBI was not amused. But that was his final trick. Eventually, they caught him, again, and this time there was no French chateau or first-class seat waiting. Just prison, for real. So, how do you go from international fugitive to FBI consultant? Easy. Be so good at breaking the law that the people who arrest you go, "Hey, actually, want to work for us?" Frank was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, which, frankly, was a pretty generous deal for someone who impersonated 3 entire professions and scammed banks across multiple continents. But here's where the plot takes a very Hollywood turn. After serving just 5 years, the FBI made him an offer. They said, "Look, you clearly know your way around a fake check. How about you use those criminal superpowers for good?" So Frank was released and hired by the FBI, not as a janitor, not as a file clerk, as a consultant on fraud, forgery, and security. Because who better to teach you how to catch con men than the king of con himself? And he didn't just consult, he built an actual career. Frank started his own company, Abagnale and Associates, and spent the next 40-plus years advising banks, businesses, and government agencies on how not to get scammed by someone who looks like a 19-year-old pilot with nice hair. He gave lectures, he wrote books, and in 2002, his life story was turned into a little-known movie called Catch Me If You Can, starring some guy named Leonardo DiCaprio. Maybe you've heard of him. Frank Abagnale went from criminal mastermind to celebrated security expert and now gives talks on ethics, which is the kind of irony that belongs in a museum. Or a TED Talk. Was he a genius? Maybe. A liar? Definitely. A legend? Absolutely. Don't try this at home, or anywhere really. Thanks for watching. And remember, if someone tells you they're a pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer, they're probably just a teenager with a typewriter and too much confidence. See you in the next one, where hopefully someone makes slightly better choices.